Howdy, this is Jim Rutt, and this is The Jim Rutt Show. Listeners have asked us to provide pointers to some of the resources we talk about on the show. We now have links to books and articles referenced in recent podcasts that are available on our website. We also offer full transcripts. Go to jimruttshow.com. That's jimruttshow.com. Today's guest is Mark Stahlman. Mark is a biologist, a computer architect, and ex-Wall Street technology strategist. And he's the president of the not-for-profit Center for the Study of Digital Life. You can find out more about that organization at digitallife.center. He also writes an interesting Substack at exogenous.substack.com. As always, links to that and anything else we reference in the article, you can be found on our episode page at jimruttshow.com. Welcome back, Mark.
Jim, it's great to be talking to you again.
Yeah, it's always good. With lots of interesting conversations. Don't always agree, but that's all right. That's part of the fun. Mark's a returning guest. He's been on, I don't know how many times, 3 or 4 at least. Most recently in EP 290, where we talked about Trump as the avatar of the digital paradigm shift. It was good. Today we're going to talk mostly about the new Pope. Mark is my go-to guy on things Catholic. He's one of these real Catholics, goes to Latin Mass, the whole schmear, and very thoughtful, smart guy, despite that, right? So, we somehow got reconnected recently and decided, hey, let's do a podcast about the new Pope. So let's hop into it.
Well, this is a very remarkable development. I know many people who literally fell off their chairs when this guy got elected and picked his name. The selection of the name Leo XIV has enormous significance for those who've been paying attention, which of course doesn't mean every Catholic, but a lot of people I know are paying attention, and this was the last thing they expected. It's a very big deal.
Yeah, I've noticed that this was a big surprise. A couple of things were a surprise. One, that it happened so quickly, right? A lot of these things go multiple rounds. And also, that was this complete dark horse American, which wasn't on anybody's league tables.
Well, as it turns out, and this is, I think, probably the most important thing we're going to say today, the Catholic Church has gone missionary, and they got themselves a missionary in this new Pope. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that, like any large organization, you've been involved with many of these, there's a whole series of different concentric circles, and you might think that the Pope is somehow sitting on a throne someplace, and he's surrounded by various insulating layers, the most important of which it would be the permanent bureaucracy, otherwise known as the Curia in Rome, or mostly in Rome. All of that has been bypassed here. In fact, this new Pope, Leo XIV, most people didn't know this, but he was working very closely with Francis, who had pissed everybody off, and so people weren't even paying attention. And so he was elected, Leo XIV, the new Pope, was elected by cardinals in Africa and Asia who had been appointed by Francis.
I had read that.
Yeah. So talk about decentering an organization.
And of course, the numbers bear it out. The Catholicism in the U.S. is about static. In Europe, it's declining, but it's booming in both sub-Saharan Africa, and I didn't really know this till I started doing my research, in Asia as well. And soon, the preponderance of Catholics will be outside of the traditional West, which is kind of interesting. The other thing that's interesting is Francis, right? The kind of the cartoon version of Francis is he was this radical lefty, right? But as I was doing my research for this episode, I came up with a much more nuanced understanding. In fact, the thing that most impressed me was a review of Francis's pontificate by a Bishop Robert Barron, who's thought to be conservative, and it came out in First Things, which is a quite conservative journal of society and religion, which I have subscribed to for 30 years. Know your enemy, right? It was way...
Well, you will remember that First Things began as a kind of apology for capitalism in the, quote, conservative Catholic ranks. So maybe that's why you've been subscribing for so long. So Novak and people like that were associated with it. It's not quite there now.
Yeah, it's very different. Reno has been the editor the last several years, and he has taken into a different direction. But it's still one of the best, well-edited, quality thing. It's one of the few magazines I still get in paper. And also, they use good paper and good ink, which matters.
I have a promised luncheon date with R.R. Reno, which I'm going to cash in on one of these days. So that's a few years old, but I'm looking forward to meeting him.
Now, when you do, kick him in the ass for me. I've binged him a couple times, come on my show to talk about Return of the Strong Gods. Crickets, no response at all. But kick him in the butt and say he's missed an opportunity here to peddle his wares.
I can do that.
Go ahead, do that. Appreciate it. Anyway, before we go further into Pope Leo XIV, maybe give us your perspective on Francis.
This will be a unusual perspective, I'm sure. Francis was a thug. What does that mean? It means that his predecessor, who did the extraordinary thing of resigning, people keep talking about an earlier resignation which had nothing to do with the current one, but just happened with Benedict XVI, or B16, as we sometimes call him, is that he stepped down, and then there were two popes, I guess, for a while. He's gone now, but he was emeritus pope, which is a completely odd thing. So what was going on here? And my answer to that is that the worst part of the Catholic Church, which is usually the case in a large hierarchical organization, you could say the same about IBM or probably Microsoft, was the permanent bureaucracy. And they had been very aggressive against B16. B16 was a South German theologian, relatively frail guy. He had repeatedly attempted to resign. The Pope for him was St. John Paul III. He kept trying to resign, and you have been in these situations, I'm sure, and the boss wouldn't let him go. So when he became Pope, he was reluctant from day one, and then it only got worse. Jorge Bergoglio, who then became Francis, he was someone who put himself through college before he was a priest. He put himself through chemical engineering as a bouncer in the port of Buenos Aires.
Oh, I love that. That's great. Both parts. Chemical engineering is probably the toughest undergraduate major. I mean, it is a nut buster of the first water. So that's impressive. And that he was a bouncer on the waterfront, even more impressive.
Well, as you can well imagine, to be a bouncer on the waterfront, you have to have a loaded pistol in your waistband. You don't go to work, with a paring knife. This is a very serious situation. And so that's why I say, in quotes, that he was a thug. So he was brought in. I don't know to what degree B16 was involved. Nobody does. But the movie Two Popes, I think, is a fairly accurate description of how they got along with each other. But he was brought in to knock these Curia guys, to whack them upside the head with a 2x4. And he did it. He put through a completely new constitution for the church. He reorganized dramatically the Curia. And as a result of this, he wound up in one of his most important, but probably least attended to, annual events. He did what was called a letter to the Curia on Christmas. So his Christmas letter, a few years back, he effectively got up in front of the whole Curia and said, boys, you're all fired. Unfortunately, I don't have anybody to replace you with. So you go back to your office tomorrow, but I want you to understand that this is just not going to continue. We're not going to keep on going this way. So as a result, of course, everybody hated him. He had very, very few, and Leo XIV, Prevost, was one of the very few who worked closely with him. And that was not generally known because most people just rejected him. So you're absolutely correct. Most of what's been written about Francis has been written by his opponents. Much of it is tendentious, if not seriously opinionated and unfactual. Be that as it may, we really have a continuation of many of the key pieces that Francis put in place, but with a much kinder, gentler Francis, who everybody's applauding, as opposed to trying to figure out how to throw him into the lion pit in the Colosseum.
I got to ask you a question. If he was so hated, how did he get elected Pope?
He got elected Pope because the feeling was, we need a tough guy to clean this place up. But as you know very well, particularly in executive suites and so forth, the tough guy is going to come in and piss everybody off. He was elected on the resignation of B16 to read the Riot Act, particularly to the Curia, the permanent bureaucracy. He did it. So now we have a situation where Leo XIV inherits a very different church. The other thing that Francis did, and this is a very important part of this conversation, is he emphasized, and of course the implementation was imperfect at best, something called synodality. And synodality is this urge to decentralize, to push things down to the grassroots level, which tend to be the diocesan or maybe archdiocesan level, above the parish. And it was not implemented well, and all sorts of people have complaints about it, all of which is very reasonable, but it's been an emphatic part of Leo XIV's statements that he is going to continue it and strengthen it. So this decentering of what might be described as a medieval monarchy, about which most of us know very little about how they actually operated, but the notion that there's a tyrant, there's actually a book that has, I think, finally been claimed by its author, title of which is Dictator Pope. So the casting of Francis, the thug, as a dictator may have some truth to it, but we're past that now, and now we're going to try to implement what's been put in place over the course of the last 2 years.
It would be interesting. And it's interesting that Pope Francis' exterior reputation was this kind guy that washed the feet of beggars and
Right.
very much of a pastoral type pope. It did not have any idea that he was the master bureaucratic operator behind the scenes. That's actually good to be able to run the two faces simultaneously, right?
Isn't it? Yeah.
I will confess to have used that trick on a time or two. Be that smiling nice guy, but who's also the iron fist when needed, right?
Yeah, Jim, you've just advised me to kick the ass of the editor of a magazine you've been subscribing to for 36 years. My guess is that you've had a few opportunities to do that yourself.
On occasion. Not with this particular guy, though. Let's go back to something you mentioned before, which was that the selection of the name Leo XIII is significant in your mind. And I think when we first started communicating about this, you suggested I go back and read Leo XIII's, what it's called Rerum Novarum, I think it is, written in 1891. And I did. And it was quite interesting. I mean, it was kind of I think, fairly reasonable centrist position about how the church should deal with modernity. Maybe why don't you give us a quick précis from your perspective of what Leo XIII was talking about, and then tie that back to why that's significant with respect to Leo XIV.
So let's jump in the Wayback Machine here, and let's recognize that in the late 19th century, the Catholic Church, primarily based in Europe, was on the ropes. In particular, in Germany, something we have now transposed into English as culture war, Kulturkampf, had removed the Catholic Church from their role in education in Germany. France had not recovered from Napoleon, who'd removed the church from their teaching responsibilities. In Italy, because the Papal Estates, which were the central across the middle of the peninsula, had been captured by the Republicans. And the hostility between the church and the Italian political establishment, basically telling Catholics in Italy, don't vote for any of these guys. The hostility between the church and France, Germany, Italy, and beyond was really severe. So into that steps Leo XIII.
What year was that? Why don't we give our listeners some context?
I believe he came to the papacy in 1878, I'm going to go with.
I have to hit the Google here and see what the Google says. 1878, boy, you're a good Catholic.
One of his most important encyclicals, which is the one that revived the approach to Thomas Aquinas, was 1879. So I knew roughly the time zone we're dealing with here. One of the first things that Leo XIII did before reviving the interest in Thomas Aquinas, which was crucial in itself, which I'll explain in a minute, is he went and negotiated with the Germans and effectively shut down Kulturkampf. So he was making some very bold approaches successfully. So he straightens out the situation in Germany. He then publishes this Aeterni Patris encyclical. Thomas Aquinas had been at various points throughout church history very important, but he had largely fallen out of favor by the 19th century. So, for instance, the critical event that precedes him is a very circle the wagons defensive Catholic Church from the First Vatican Council, which ended literally when the revolutionaries took over the papal estates and effectively deposed the Pope. So the big thing that came out of that was this notion of papal infallibility. So you can imagine an organization that's on the ropes. Everybody is trying to figure out how to undermine them. Then they go to Rome. They say the Pope can say things on behalf of God. Not everything he says, but when he speaks ex cathedra, he is literally 100%, these are God's words. Nobody who is successful in their organizational life would ever do that. That's like an admission of total defeat. No one's paying attention to me, so now I'm going to speak on behalf of God. It led to all kinds of, and probably Lord Acton is one of the characters you remember from your history here.
Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Acton was a Catholic who effectively defied papal infallibility, as did many others. So it was a big mess that Leo stepped into. But he, in part because of his brother, in part because of others in his family, he really tried to put Humpty Dumpty, the Catholic Church, back together again. And so the most important thing that is enduring here, which you had a chance to read, which is a part of the larger story, Rerum Novarum, he was effectively saying, look, we've got Marxists on the barricades, we've got reactionaries declaring all kinds of offense against organized labor, people are dying on the picket lines or in strikes. We've got to stop all of this. And you're correct for a late 19th century position, for a church that had never said anything about this before. He's opening up a massive new can of worms. He's saying both the capitalist and the labor need to behave themselves. We all need to figure out a way to make this thing work. Very, very powerful statement at that time in that context.
Interesting. So what does that say about the signal that the new guy has sent by adopting Leo XIV?
Well, he made it very clear the overall category into which Rerum Novarum and a series of other encyclicals, because he's not the last one to speak about this. And in fact, the one that for the listeners, if they would like to delve into this, the Pius XI in 1931 published a very important encyclical entitled Quadragesimo Anno, 40 years. So it literally was published 40 years after Rerum Novarum. And so the difference between the 1890s and the 1930s, of course, historically is huge. And that encyclical, the second of them, there's a third done by John Paul II, Centissimos Annos, 100 years. And there's many other documents on this, but it turns out that Europe has made use of many of the principles from these Catholic encyclicals. Most importantly, subsidiarity. Now, subsidiarity is crucial because it declares that not just decisions need to be made at the lowest possible level, but that responsibilities need to be taken up throughout the entire hierarchy. So you don't get to make decisions at a lower level unless you take responsibility for what you say. So the idea you can just sit back and let somebody else make your life decisions for you, some distant place, you don't know who the people are, you don't know why they're doing it, but you're powerless. This was a very important principle after World War II in Europe. In particular, as you might imagine, there were some really aggressive efforts to basically make sure that Germany would never be an industrial power. And what intervened in that were a series of Catholic economists who said, on the basis of subsidiarity, if you do that, yes, you can screw Germany, but you're going to screw yourself too. The whole European project will collapse if you take that approach. And as we know in the end, that was not the approach that was taken. Instead, the Marshall Plan was taken. Instead, Germany was rebuilt. And that was largely done under the economic heading of subsidiarity done by Catholic economists. It wound up in the Maastricht Declaration, so the treaty that established the EU has subsidiarity. That word is critical in the formation of it. I don't think it was necessarily followed, and indeed Brexit could be described as, among other things, and I'm not sure this is close to as important as protecting the prerogatives of the monarchy, which is probably the more important part of Brexit. Brexit, in the end, even though the Queen was against it. But no, the subsidiarity is the anchor of Catholic social teaching, CST. And that is exactly what Leo XIV said, why he picked the successor name to Leo XIII, that he was going to be the Pope of Catholic social teaching. JP2 wrote an encyclical 100 years after.
JP2 for non-insiders, that's John Paul II, right?
John Paul II, yeah, sorry. B16 and JP2 are the way I tend to abbreviate these guys, if you don't mind. And so he went so far as to form an organization, John Paul II did, to support Catholic social teaching. But then he stepped away from all of it. He was a busy man. He had lots of other things he had to worry about. And so, in fact, that organization, formed by JP2, which is supposed to be the church's primary organization for Catholic social teaching, has become a fancy dinner party for Italian bankers. It's doing none of the work that it should do. And I've had contact with a variety of people who have attempted to sort of redirect it into a more aggressive, outward-facing program and failed. What's going to happen now, I'm quite sure, under Leo XIV, is that there will be conferences. There will probably be new organizations that are started. I think much of this is probably already underway. It was what was announced when he came in. So that's why he picked the name, is he thought that the church needed to, in addition to decentering, in addition to moving power away from the permanent bureaucracy, curia, and into, in fact, the hands of the lower levels of the church, both clerical and laymen, which is the synodality. In addition to that, he is going to push this whole Catholic social teaching exercise forward. And my hope is, I know some of the individuals who are involved, but it's too early to get a clear reading. I think the recognition, because he paired that conversation with the conversation about AI. So there's a recognition this is not your favorite old popes or old saints Catholic social teaching. We're in a whole new situation here. So we have termed that digital Catholic social teaching. In 22, I actually did a 8-part series available on YouTube on digital Catholic social teaching. So this is why people that I know who've been very frustrated that this wasn't going anywhere fell off their chairs when they heard the announcement.
Interesting. We're going to revisit that, and particularly the AI part, which again has gotten quite a bit of chattering in the AI world, interestingly enough. Before we go back to that, though, maybe a little bit just on some of the more surface aspects. When I was doing my research, one thing that popped out was Francis always opted for great personal simplicity, and Leo XIV, when he made his first public appearance, wore the traditional mozzetta, the ermine-trimmed robe that Francis had never worn. And I think he's probably moved into the palace and all that sort of stuff. What do those style choices tell you about both men, actually, Francis and...
If Francis was elected to knock some heads, he was in many critical respects publicly in opposition to the church that he headed. So that opposition showed in these stylistic questions. Didn't wear the red slippers, didn't live in the palace, lived in a guest house instead. So this was all his personal style. And he, had, of course, had a long history in the church by then, and had, in particular, he was well practiced at being widely disliked. Argentina, which was his base of operations, he had initially been brought back to Argentina, aborting his attempted PhD in Frankfurt on the theologian Romano Guardini. He was brought back to basically take the severely left-wing Jesuits of Argentina, the liberation theology Jesuits, and bring them back to the church. And I think what I've heard is that he lasted less than a week in the Jesuit house in Buenos Aires. Jesuits tend to all live in the same house, and that's been a pattern for a long time now. The way I heard it was that he did not visit a Jesuit house after being kicked out of the one in Buenos Aires until he was elected Pope. He never went back to a Jesuit house. So all of this left-wing Jesuit stuff about him is just more fodder for a really messed up bureaucratic situation, which is hopefully now behind us.
So, but these more symbolic readjustments to the traditional dress and residence of the Pope. What signal does that? Do you think Leo XIV is sending with that part of his adjustment and his personal behavior?
No need for us to have fights with each other anymore. We have obviously some very important responsibilities, tasks to pursue here. Unlike Francis, I'm not here to hit you upside the head. That's already happened. I'm going to not allow you to have any objections to me because of the shoes I wear.
Gotcha. So that's interesting. That's interesting. If that's indeed his theory, that trick will sometimes work. Now, I've also read, however, that the reforms that Francis began are by no means complete, and that there are still, particularly on the financial side, still great needs to reform the administration of the church.
Honestly, I don't know so much. There's a long history of lack of transparency, of scandals and more potential scandals. So the Vatican Bank has been a strange component of the overall banking system. But let me use your question as an opportunity. I'm not just simply saying that the world is decentering. I'm not just simply saying that ideas that you've been kicking around for a decade, 2 decades, about devolving these bureaucracies, hierarchies, and so forth. I'm going to go beyond that. And I'm not yet ready to talk about the specifics of this. Maybe we'll have a chance in a later podcast, but there is a massive effort now underway to build a completely new financial system. It'll be based upon central bank-supported stablecoins, as others have reported. It's going to change the whole international trade settlement situation. It does not mean the dollar is going to be discarded, but you're going to be able to settle in a number of other currencies. And from what I'm hearing, the so-called axis of evil, China, Russia, and Iran, are all involved in this new system. They've all been briefed, recruited, plans are in place. This is a big deal. So,
yeah, and I think a well overdue big deal. The U.S. has been fat, lazy, and just bad in riding the advantages it gets from being the global reserve currencies, developed some hideously bad habits about consuming more than it makes. So I've long advocated to get the dollar overthrown. It's going to hurt like shit for the first couple of years, but on the other side of it, I think we'll be a much better off, much healthier society.
People keep going back to FDR's meeting with King Saud and how all this ties back to oil. And as we all know, oil is not the big story anymore in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, maybe the big, giant, mile-long building is a disaster, but it's a reflection of the fact that the Saudis don't want to simply be an oil country anymore. They actually want to be, as was shown in this most recent visit by President Trump to the kingdom, they really want to be involved in a very much more front row seat sort of fashion. So a trading system based upon post-World War II Saudi oil, the use-by date expired a long time ago. So the details of this, I only have access to a few people who are involved with this. It reminds me of, I was tangentially perhaps this conversation, I was very close to the head of Olivetti, Vittorio Cassoni, who was also a chemical engineer, by the way, on loan from Olivetti to run AT&T computers for a while. We became close friends. Unfortunately, he died shortly after that. But I was sort of in the middle of the early efforts to build the European Union based on the bankers who were involved. So Olivetti obviously was fiat with De Benedicti. And so the European Union was a financial reorganization, not a political reorganization to begin with. So I kind of remember the intensity of what was going on there and the secrecy associated with it, parts of which I saw because I was coming in through the Olivetti side. The need to do this with digital currencies, the need to do this in a way that all the trading partners get a chance to participate and not get ripped off. This is the basis of what Trump's attempting to do with the tariffs and all the rest of it. This is a major reset of every aspect. But as you know, probably better than I, you got to reorganize the financial system if you want to make any of this stuff work.
Absolutely. Now, I will tell you, you may not know this, but there is a huge pocket of high-end blockchain developers in Dubai. Dubai has established a regime there very favorable on a tax basis, on a regulatory basis. And so a surprising number of heavy hitters in the crypto world are hanging out there. And I wonder if they're being used as to create some of this infrastructure.
Yes.
Interesting.
They are.
Interesting. I'll check with some of my people there and see what they tell me. All right, let's turn back to the Pope here. Why don't we start by, as our next step, to the degree you can, synthesize your current take on what the Church's current social teachings are at this moment in the evolution of humanity.
The three pillars of Catholic social teaching, as outlined in the three encyclicals that I just mentioned, Rerum Novarum, 1891, Quadragesimo Anno, 1931, and Centessimos Anno, 1991. The three pillars are, number one, human dignity. That's very important because you cannot have human dignity if you believe that AI can replicate humans. It goes out the window. So the Church, by declaring themselves on Catholic social teaching, cornerstoned on human dignity, has put themselves in a very strong position to distinguish between AI and human activities. Number two, subsidiarity is this principle of pushing decisions and responsibilities down as far as possible. Does not mean you don't have a federal government. You do. Some things have to be done at a federal level. Doesn't mean you don't have a military. Some things have to be done that way. But if it can be done in your own backyard, that's where it'll get done. So this decentralizing or decentering through subsidiarity, with an enormous history, particularly the early days of the EU in terms of modern history. This is a crucial approach to human organization. So we have human dignity, we have subsidiarity, and the third principle is solidarity. And solidarity, of course, is a peace initiative. It's a variety of other takes on the world. My view is that while it may have been important in the 1930s for the Church, I haven't found any significant history, but let me presume, because I know a lot about Leo XIII, and he was being fought tooth and nail, back and forth. A lot of people just ignored what he had to say. It's important, the foundation that he laid, but I think by the time we get to Pius XI in the 30s, people are paying more attention and he can mobilize things. So in particular, Pius XI, on a solidarity basis, the third leg, he mobilized something effectively and called it the Catholic International in opposition to the Communist International. Not very well known, perhaps, but he could mobilize resources around that. And one of the things that he, in particular, which I focused on in my own research, is he focused on art, literary and other expressions of art, set up various organizations and promoted it. And as we've discussed in our earlier encounters, Marshall McLuhan is very important to me. Marshall McLuhan should be much more important to the Catholic Church. He hasn't been up till now. But Marshall McLuhan was caught up in that Leo XII. So I think what we're going to see here is much more serious thinking about AI, much more serious thinking, which is human dignity, much more serious thinking about hierarchical organizations decentralizing, which I know is a project that you have been involved with your own ideas for quite a while now. You were on that particular merry-go-round before many other people. And solidarity is going to wind up being a very important part of this, because it'll wind up flying in the face of all of these forever wars. The forever wars are not going to be able to be sustained under these circumstances. You reorganize the world's financial system. You reorganize trade towards some measure of fairness. You build a new, not necessarily reserve currency, but settlement capabilities. I'm not here predicting that the dollar will stop being the reserve currency, but I am predicting that settlement will shift away, probably fairly quickly, away from dollar or dollar oil sort of axis.
Well, I will say, as a student of monetary theory, that settlement and reserve are closely linked. They're not exactly coupled. They're strongly linked. If it's a settlement currency, that's what I want to hold in reserve, at least at my top tier reserves, right? And further, if they engineer it correctly, it ought to be fairly resistant to inflation, which will certainly make it better than the dollar, which has been plagued forever by inflation. So I would suggest that that's a little bit Pollyannish to think that you can switch the settlement.
I think what's going on here, because my access to, remember, I'm primarily, my background, and I have said this to a few other people recently, I tend to have access to some information based on personal relationships that tie back into my Wall Street career. So I'll give you an example. Last summer, fall, I did interesting conversations with many people that I worked with, still in touch with, about the Trump election in November. And I kept getting repeatedly the senior Wall Street people that I was talking to, we're looking forward to Trump. We know there's going to be volatility, but we long ago mastered volatility. Goldman Sachs does not care if the market goes up or down. They will do very well in either direction. Others will maybe not quite so much. But the support that Trump has gotten from the financial community must in part be because he is supporting and moving along this financial reorganization. So the fact that BRICS, for instance, says, we're not trying to replace the dollar as the reserve currency, a fine statement for today and for this month. As you have correctly pointed out here, if they pull this thing off a year or two from now, inevitably, all of that's going to shift.
Exactly. That's a feel-good, sound-good bullshit that anybody who knows anything about monetary theory knows not true.
It's like Leo XIV. I'll be glad to wear the red slippers. We're not going to have a fight over the red slippers. We're not going to have a fight over the dollar's reserve currency, and yet he's got his sneakers in his briefcase.
Good. Let's now pop up to a higher level of strategic thinking. One of the core elements that's come out of our Game B analysis is the concept of the multipolar trap. And that is, in a community of people who mostly want to do the right thing, all it takes is one or two people who want to do the wrong thing, that if it turns out to be profitable and effective in the short term, can force everybody else into doing the wrong thing. The classic example I've been using lately is look at a class of new associates at a management consulting firm who there's a lot of pressure to put in the long hours, do lots of work to get on the partner track and maybe get to be made partner, make a lot of money. One of the guys starts doing Adderall, not because he's ADHD, but because Adderall lets you work 3 hours more a day at the same level.
Well, because everybody's doing Adderall. It's a standard part of that business.
Well, that's the next thing. Then everybody else has to, because I can't let Bill work 3 hours more than me. So we all do Adderall, and we're all going to burn out our dopamine systems, and yet none of us can stop. This is the essence of a multipolar trap. Once you start to see multipolar traps, you see them throughout all competitive social systems. And so this is one of the core lenses I use to think about proposals like solidarity, dignity, and subsidiarity. But let's start with solidarity, right? Solidarity historically has been a word that's been linked to things like trade unions, for instance, right? The solidarity of the working man.
And to be sure, in 1891, that was important.
Yep. And could be again, still is in places like Sweden, where like 75% and Denmark, where 75% of the workforce is unionized, though in honest, non-thuggish unions, unlike the American counterparts in many cases. There are still some good unions in America, particularly the trade unions, but some of the other ones are pretty thuggish.
But not SEIU, correct?
Yeah, not SAIU, that's for sure. So when you think about solidarity, whenever there's a system of solidarity, there's always benefits for cooperation and benefits for defection, right? And this is what essentially has killed the labor union in America. We've made it easy to defect from working with unions by moving to right-to-work states, right?
Move to Alabama, right?
Yeah, exactly. Move to Alabama. You don't need no thinking unions, right? So in a competitive world, how does the Catholic Church envision defeating the multipolar trap tendency, which inevitably erodes things like solidarity, unless there's an overarching regulatory framework which we all agree to? Do we all agree not to do this because we understand that it produces a race to the bottom dynamic? And our society seems to be very bad at recognizing these traps and doing anything about it these days.
I don't have a very good answer for you, except to say the Catholic Church is going to start with the Catholic Church. So building solidarity within the Catholic Church, which has been heavily factionalized. So here I'm going to just simply say that the right-wing, left-wing distinction that we've been living with since at least the French Revolution, if not before, progressive, conservative, however you wish to name it, no longer makes any sense under digital conditions.
Talk a little bit more about that, because obviously that's a huge idea, if true.
The notion of class war, which Marx and Engels gave us so emphatically. I've been a student, I've been a hands-on participant in some sense in Marxism for quite a few years. A couple of years ago, I was fortunate enough to be invited to come to the Second World Congress on Marxism, taking place at Peking University in Beijing, at PQU. And because of language and because of my own curiosity, I went out of my way to sit with the Western Marxists at lunch and dinner. Uniformly, they declared that what the Chinese were doing was not Marxism. It had so much of a Chinese overlay or with Chinese characteristics. Are there left-wing and right-wing components within the Communist Party of China, CPC? Not as much as there once was. So you probably know more than I do about Tiananmen Square. But amongst the things that are interesting is that nobody was killed in the square. There was no massacre. Furthermore, that event is just one on a long timeline of very severe left-wing, right-wing conflicts within the CPC. And it took them a long time to, in some sense, resolve it. But the right wing, if you will, insisted on keeping the structure of the Communist Party as it was, dictatorial, authoritarian. The left wing, if you will, wanted to open up. So they compromised. That compromise is probably not going to hold because of digital. What has happened is that Xi Jinping, who is not very well understood in the West, I just recently participated in a conference in which the standard Western view of Xi Jinping's authoritarianism, which maps into the Chinese quasi-religious structure of legalism, is very widespread and wrong. In fact, today's Chinese leadership, which as best as I can tell, is not well understood in the West, is more Taoist than anything else. Now, Taoism, for those who haven't studied China, might have recognized that Taoism was the nature religion. so to speak? Well, Jim Rutt is a natural scientist. And so if you were looking for a natural scientist in China, you wouldn't find them in a Confucian temple. You'd find them in the modern version of Taoism. So it's happened throughout the party structure and the other power structures in China, but it's the party. The party is no longer interested in a left-wing, right-wing conflict like they were at the time of Tiananmen Square. Obviously, many of the hardliners aren't with us anymore. So we're a generation later in this whole process. But digital demands of us a different level of sensibility about these topics. If in fact, so now we're back to the Catholic human dignity. If in fact AI posits that human beings are really no more than programmable biological computers, that is going to get a lot of people very upset. And it's already happening. So the shift on the part of human beings who are absolutely, as you described it, prone to fall into traps, prone to not understanding what the larger dynamics are involved here, just continuing to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. Digital says, stop. You've painted yourself into a corner here. You've lost track of your humanity, acquiesced to universal grammar. You've let the linguists tell you that you can be programmed. Lots of interest in brainwashing nowadays also for a variety of reasons, but all linked to this. So as humanity, not all of us, it doesn't take all of us, you know very well, 5-10% of the population can really make a huge difference. The population is shifting away from, why are we fighting each other? Why don't we bring ourselves together in a much more serious fashion? There will still be lots of divisions, there'll still be lots of factions, but it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be the old left-right division. And digital is forcing us into that situation.
Now, it would be nice if it were true. I don't see any sign of it so far. In fact, I see quite the opposite, that we're weirdly, at the same time, both more polarized, more fragmented, and with considerably less trust across our society than we were, say, 50 years ago.
Well, this is the whole media story. We have moved from television, which organized our lives. Yeah, there are 500 shows, nothing's on, but we can pick one that we want and binge watch it anyway, and so forth. Polarization that you're referring to is a result of the collapse of the narrative. The narrative, the post-World War II globalist narrative, the only way we can avoid fighting each other is by one world government. That has completely fallen apart. So we're now in a interim time period where these polarizations are being accentuated, particularly by the television and related media. So we still have Fox fighting CNN. The ratings are going down on all of that, the motivation for all of that, and we're getting a new generation. So one of the things we did at CSDL, the center, is we started an online graduate school called Trivium University. And Trivium University was intended, it didn't wind up exactly that way, but a significant part of those who came into this are Gen Z. This is very, very important. Gen Z, according to the people that I talk with who have big budgets in the marketing and PR space, Gen Z has already distinguished themselves in many ways as being quite different from their predecessors. So Gen X, Gen Y, otherwise known as millennials, and Gen Z. In the marketing community, we have a very strong understanding that we're witnessing significant generational changes. By the time we get to the alpha and beta generations, which are coming next, these kids will never have watched a television show. They will be completely free of what was driving that polarization. I'm not saying they'll agree with each other, not saying they'll like each other. I'm just saying that the forces have changed. And in this new situation in which we are, I think your characterization is a good one. On the one hand, it looks this way, and on the other hand, it looks that way. Well, that's That's always characteristic of transitional periods. But we know not only that we're in a transition, our gut tells us that, nobody can ignore that, but we know the direction that it's taking us. It's not random. All of which, for me at least, speaks very positively towards an opportunity to redraw the lines, but what's important is breaking down the old lines.
That'd be good. What role do you see the new Pope playing in this, right? In the West, a lot of this digital stuff is playing out. The Catholic Church is losing ground and has been losing ground for a few generations. It's been accelerated with the sex abuse scandals and what have you. Does the Pope hope to regain ground in the West, or is he going to depend on the growing numbers elsewhere?
I think he's going to be very focused on Europe. Now, we can throw our hands up and say Europe is lost. We can throw our hands up and say, what a disaster. But the truth of the matter is, in the most important country as far as the Vatican is concerned, France, Catholic country, vocations for priests, first communions are significantly up among French Catholics. Now, I would not be surprised at some point here, because the French politics is so messed up at this point. Can you believe these European countries that are just simply canceling elections and banning parties? I mean, this cannot be sustained. So statistics, the series, you know how this works. You ask the same question year after year after year, and it may no longer be the right question, but statisticians all want to have a series. So they want to compare the answer to the same question over the course of 20 years. Well, by and large, those are not the right questions anymore. So you have to kind of be on the ground in the situation itself to judge it. And the people that I know who are in that situation say that Europe is a very interesting, dynamic, mixed bag at this point. So I suspect, but what I don't know, we've stated and many others have confirmed that the Asian and African cardinals elected Pope Leo XIV. What do they want from him? So my guess is that in terms of emphasis, a lot of people have indicated they thought that an American Pope would bring more American money into the church. I think that Europe is going to get a lot of attention, but so will the rest of the world. So this will be among Catholics. This is not going to be, yes, the Vatican offered itself as a negotiating point, and yes, on Russia-Ukraine, and Russia has responded in public saying we're an Orthodox Christian country, therefore it would be inappropriate for us to negotiate the Vatican. No offense, we like you guys, but the Vatican's diplomatic efforts are quite significant. A fellow at the center is Victor Guyten. He's a journalist writing about the diplomatic efforts. God's Diplomats is his most recent book. So, Jim, I think that one of the people who was most surprised at his election was Leo XIV. So it'll take a while to see this all panning out, but it's going to be, if he's got the hands on deck to help him with this, and that may or may not be the case, it's going to be full court around the world.
Interesting. You mentioned France. Now, in Europe in general, the Catholic Church is gaining, as you mentioned, is starting to pick up a little steam with the young people, but is falling away with the middle-aged people. And the big, as you know, the big political question in France is whether the traditional laicite,
laicite is written into the Fifth Republic Constitution. I believe it was first put in the Fourth Republic Constitution. Laicite means effectively there is no such thing as a religion. We're all the same. We're all laymen. And it's right there, I think, in the first couple of paragraphs of the current Constitution of France. I don't know enough about the internal situation but one of the things that would not surprise me in all this mess around Macron and so forth, parties being excluded, is the French seem to like to do this. So, and I have no knowledge of it happening, but I wouldn't be surprised if we get a new French constitution out of this.
The Catholic Church is losing its power, but the Muslims are coming on strong with great fervor. And this is, of course, a challenge to Christendom across Europe.
Yes.
And Francis was pretty well known for reaching out to establish better relations with Muslims. Do you think Leo XIV will continue this, or?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Jewish outreach, Catholic Orthodox outreach, ecumenical contact is very important, and that will continue.
All right.
Well, I think the most important thing for people to keep in mind here is that we're not all sitting around wondering what this liminal situation is going to turn into. The wheels are turning aggressively. The Catholic Church is only a part of that, but an important part of that. There is a new system currently being designed, and over the next 5+ years will be implemented. Post-World War II, financial, military, trade, political organizations are all now obsolete. Digital has forced this change upon us. It's not that we couldn't have continued if we continued without that impetus, but digital changes everything. And so as a result of this, the Church's role in helping us to emphasize the human being different from the machine, the Church's emphasis that humans are not stupid. They don't need to be technocratically controlled. They, in fact, can figure out what needs to be done at lower levels, subsidiarity. And these wars have got to stop. Nobody who I am in contact with, and I'm primarily, I have certain access into at least parts of what you might call the intelligence community. I have access into certain parts of what you would call the financial community, because that was my career, Wall Street. Pace at which things are now moving, almost completely unreflected in the headlines or the mainstream press or most of the alternate press. These people don't have the connections to figure out what's going on. Big things are coming. Decentralizing and plans for how to do this are now being listened to. You've had a lot of experience in various aspects of this. My guess is that one of your reactions to our conversation today, I think you said it a couple of times in the conversation, is about goddamn time.
Exactly right. As you know, this has been the work that me and others have been working on, but we have been patient, waiting for the right time. Maybe the right time is finally here.
I believe it is.
All right, Mark Stahlman from the Center for Digital Life. Another excellent and interesting conversation.
Thanks, Jim.
All right.
Audio production and editing by Andrew Blevins Productions. Music by Tom Muller at modernspacemusic.com.